Hello, class. So today I am doing the slides, the video for, for chapter 8. So this one we will use your PowerPoint slides. And so if you have it with you, you just kind of like follow along. That will help. Chapter 8. So again, this is, we're getting deeper into the macroeconomic topic now. Chapter 8 is on what we call aggregate supply. I'm going to use short form AGG, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, that's all my short form. DD stands for demand, SS stands for supply. So, and we also are going to look at the shift in aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve. So if you remember the earlier chapter on supply and demand, so pretty much the same. But now you're looking at the whole economy, okay? Instead of one particular sector like product market, you're looking at pizza market or any kind of product and services. You're now looking at the whole economy with all the sectors put together: healthcare, education, computing industry, software, hardware industry, agricultural industry, mineral industries, services like banking sectors, and so on. Okay. So basically, when you look at aggregate demand, you're looking at the, let me present it with a graph. So again, economics deal with a lot of graph, as you now. So your aggregate demand curve is typically downward sloping. So I'm going to use AD to represent it. Okay, this is basically the amount of real domestic output, the GDP, but in terms of real dollar value. So in other words, we want to look at when you have taken into account the inflation. So and then this PI up here is your price level or inflation. So that's the start here. And if you remember your GDP equation before, we have consumption, and then we have investment, and then we have government expenditure, and then we have NX. So I don't know if that was presented before, but this C stands for consumption, I stands for investment, G stands for government expenditure, NX is your net export. And there's another part to your net exports is your export minus import. So M stands for imports there. So basically what we're saying here is your consumption and investment are basically consumed by the consumers as well as businesses. Because business and households or individuals, you not only consume but you also make investment. So G is your government expenditure and NX is your net export, which is export minus import. So if you export more, that's good for your economy. Because if this goes up, then your real GDP goes up, basically in the same direction. So likewise, if all this consumption, investment, government expenditure goes up, then your real GDP goes up as well. But if you import more, you import more, Mexicans, tortillas and ponchos, then more than you export cowboy boots and cowboy hats, for example, and this is a negative term, then your NX, your net export will come down. So this is your net export. And this is export minus import. So in other words, you want less import but more export in order to benefit your GDP of your country. Okay, and so the next thing is there are three theories that are used to explain why your AD curve is downward sloping. So the first one is called real balance effects. Okay, I'm just going to write them down and then explain it accordingly. And then you have a foreign purchase effects, and then the last one you have is interest rate effects. Okay, so basically all these three theories are explaining why AD curve is downward sloping. You know, it's just like a demand curve. Why is it downward sloping? And I think we talked about it before, is substitution effects, or you have read the chapter earlier, or it could be due to income effect. So in the case of real balance effect, what it is saying is that if your prices are high, you know, so the higher the prices, then your real purchasing power or real spending power becomes lower. So that makes sense because inflation makes everybody less willing, you know, less able, not just willing, but less able to spend. Okay, so because of that, we say as prices goes up, your RGDP actually moved in this direction. So it explains the inverse relationship or the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So the second one, foreign purchase effects, has got something to do with what I talked about earlier, the exports and the imports part. So if your domestic price is so high, if let's just say they raise the price of cowboy boots and cowboy hats, and so it's harder for other countries to buy, so they buy less of it. Instead, we import more, relatively speaking. If that's the case, you know, that will have effects on your real GDP in a downward direction. So in other words, the higher your domestic price, you produce less of that good. And so not only you produce less, you know, and other countries are less willing to buy from you, so your output goes down. So therefore, your real GDP move in this direction. That also explains why it's AD curve is downward sloping. So you want to look at effects like that. If price goes up, your RGDP comes down, and vice versa. So vice versa means if your price comes down, your RGDP will move in the opposite direction. So that's what I'm trying to explain here. So now the third one is known as interest rate effect. So what it is saying is that if the price is higher, right, you know, I mean, that indicates that you have inflation rate overall. The inflation goes up. So if there's inflation, there are less borrowing. People borrow less. And also that would have effects on to lower the real GDP output as well. So, I mean, it has an impact on how people spend their money. People are less willing to spend to some extent. Less willing to borrow, less willing to spend. Because you don't have any. You know, if you cannot borrow, you can't spend. Assuming that you don't have much. Okay, next we want to introduce aggregate supply curve. So let me erase this. As you know, aggregate supply curve is just the opposite. Meaning that instead of saying that it's downward sloping, it's upward sloping. However, there are three portions of the aggregate supply curve. This is a little bit more complicated. So we start out with having a shape like that, kind of horizontal, and then it curves up, and then it becomes horizontal. Oh, excuse me, it becomes vertical. Yeah. So this horizontal portion of it is known as Keynesian range. So this part here is known as intermediate range because this is like in between. And then this vertical part here is known as your classical range. Okay. So let's explain these three portions of AES curve. Why is it like that? So let's start off with the Keynesian range here. So what this is saying is, you know, if you were to raise the, so if you were to, excuse me, the Keynesian range basically says that you have a massive unemployment. So during recession, for example, the unemployment rate is high, and you know, not everybody, but a lot of people are being laid off and not having a job. So because of that, you know, there is, if you try to increase the aggregate demand, you actually have no effects on the wages or prices. So it stay constant. In other words, um, you know, so what? You know, if you during recession, people cannot buy anyway. You know, like people cannot afford to buy, so you cannot even talk about raising prices or raising wages. So because of this overall unemployment rate that is considered so massive. So Keynesian range means like nothing happened. Yeah. You know, you could keep produce, you know, because you're deep in recession, unemployment rate is high. It would not have any impact on the prices or your wages. So, and definitely the inflation. So next, the other extreme is your classical range. So classical people and Keynesian people are usually have very interesting opposing view. So the classical people believe that, oh, you got full employment, and so if you increase a real, if you increase the aggregate demand, you know, people, that would only increase the wages and the prices. So what it is if a lot of people want to buy stuff, you have excess demand. You know, that would actually push up the inflation, push up the prices. And this is, for the most part, this is more common today in most economic textbooks. You see the classical view, you know, on the aggregate supply curve, that it should be upward sloping. In fact, some textbook will show it like, you know, not so precise, but just an upward sloping supply curve. And basically what they're saying is that, yeah, if you have excess demand, if people have money to buy, you know, then that will push the prices up. Because, you know, imagine we all have $10,000 to spare, each and every single one of them. And we drive to the mall and we try to shop, you know. And if the people at the mall see us coming and we all have $10,000 with us, you know, in our purses, they're not going to sell it to us as a discount price, because everybody has money to buy, you know, then they actually will jerk up the price, you know. So excess demand is a sign that, you know, for inflation to rise, because everybody's wealthy. Everybody could afford everything. Not afford everything, but for most things. So therefore, you know, it pushed the prices higher. Therefore, there is an upward pressure on the inflation. Okay. So we explained aggregate supply side, and then next what we want to explain is, let's talk about the shift in aggregate demand curve. So this is quite important. So we're going back to that downward sloping aggregate demand curve now. Well, actually, your textbook now makes them together. So let's just kind of like put them. I need to make this a little bit more vertical. Okay, well, that's vertical enough. So that's your AS curve. So this is the first point here. I'm going to call this point A. So I like to label with alphabet, so you know which is the first point, initial point of equilibrium, for example. So there are a few things that we want to talk about here. Okay, these are the variables that shift your AD. Number one is your tax. So we wanted to talk about, what if you increase the tax? Now, if you increase the tax, right, it has effects on the aggregate demand side. So what happened here is then we have an upward shift in aggregate demand curve. So I'm going to use a red one. Oh, actually, excuse me, the other way, yeah. So aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. This is your B. So I'm going to indicate it with arrows. So it shifts to the left because of higher tax, because if it is higher tax on the business and individual's income, then because people spend less, you know, you are less able to do business, less able to invest, and less able to consume. So that have leftward effects on the aggregate demand curve. So likewise, if you increase the interest rate, same thing. Okay, if you increase the interest rate, right, basically what this is saying is that again, for example, like it would be more expensive to borrow a loan, business loans or in the case of household, like computer loans and even college loans, for example. If that's the case, you spend less because higher interest rate means you're less able and less willing to spend, from the viewpoint of consumer and businesses. So all these two factors have the effects of shifting the AD curve to the left. So in other words, it has dampening effects on the economy. Higher tax, higher interest rate, they're good. Okay, the other one is the strength of the dollar. So let's just say stronger. A strong US dollar. How about that? Now that would affect your net exports, as we mentioned earlier, because if the dollar becomes very strong, right, that means it's more expensive for other countries to buy U.S. goods. So therefore, what happened here is they end up exporting. The U.S. end up exporting less goods to other countries, and end up importing more goods because it's cheaper to buy other countries' goods now because U.S. dollars are stronger. So that also have this effects that aggregate demand can shift to the left, and that's because of the fact that you export less. So X comes down, import goes up, so it's more negative, so NX comes down, and if NX or your net exports come down, it has a dampening effects or negative effects on your GDP. So in other words, the first three factors here, higher tax, higher interest rate, higher stronger US dollars will have the effects of shifting the aggregate demand curve for the whole economy to the left. So that's what happened. Now, if you shift to the left, right, the effects here, you can look at it a little bit more. So this is A, and this is B. So let's just say this is 200, this is 100 billions, or however amount you want to use it. And then up here, right now, U.S. GDP is like 17 trillion. So why don't we go with that number, 17 trillion, and that may be down to, say, 10. Yeah, how's that? So, and then this one would be going from A to B, this number goes down. So this would be from, say, I don't know what is the number you use, so let's just use 10 and 5. Okay, so next, there are two other factors that are mentioned here that are good, that shift the AD curve to the right instead. So this would be like if you increase the confidence. What kind of confidence are we talking about? Or if you increase the government expenditure. Like building more defense, invest more into defense, or build more public schools, public hospitals, public highways, all these are good things. Increase in confidence would be like, for example, after September 11 happened, people were very depressed. They didn't want to go travel. They did not want to invest in anything. The airlines business goes down. The hotel business, went down as well. So basically, the opposite of it is, if the stock markets are doing well, like in the mid-'80s, the markets were doing, this was the time that you had very good economy back then there is consumer and business confidence actually gone up. So if they have gone up, right, and more government expenditure, all these things have the effects of shifting the AD curve to the right. So in this case, you will have to do the diagram. Excuse me. Or what we could do is we just shift the graph the other way. Okay, so let's call this. So then this becomes A, and this becomes B here. So in other words, your starting point is at the red line here. So this is your point A, and then aggregate demand curve shift to the right because of more government spending. More government spending means, yes, it has rising or it raises GDP to be higher. So likewise, if you have more confidence in investing, investment goes up, and that could apply to household as well as businesses. Then, if that's the case, your RGDP will go up. You remember to erase that old effect there. Okay, so that's the case here. And if that's the case, AD curve, your aggregate demand curve shift to the right from point A to point B. And of course, all this thing would be the reverse. So now this would be rising because from A to B is a higher point. And then here would be increasing from 10 to 17 trillion US dollars, for example. Okay, so these are some of the things that you should be very familiar with, and with this kind of effects with you. So assuming that if all these things go down, then we have the vice versa effects. In other words, then AD curve will shift to the right, and here the AD curve will shift to the left, if it is a vice versa effects. So next we want to look at what happens if you shift the AS curve. Now AS curve is a little bit more complicated, but the rightward and the leftward shift will be the same. I mean, you could do the graph by itself, but I think I'd rather do the AS curve shift together with the AD curve. So with that, I'm going to erase all this thing because this affects the aggregate demand side, but not the aggregate supply side. I'm going to erase this, and let's go ahead and do this. Okay, I think we still need the basic one, and then I'm going to erase all that. So this will be variables. That shift AS. Okay, and we only have 3 variables, unlike the aggregate demand curve. So let's redraw that curve right there, and this is your AD curve. Oops, so that's your beginning point, let's call it point A. Okay, so here's our starting point. We have the original aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve intersecting at point A. So the next thing we say is, okay, so the thing that the variables or determinants that affect supply side and demand curve, as I said before, are very different. So let's just say that the input, the input prices, I think that's what we use here. Input prices go up. Now, what are input prices? These are cost of production. So, like if you're in a farming business, all your inputs would be like labor, it would be like capital, a tractor, or harvesting machine, or it could be your fertilizers. So these are your input prices. So to some extent, if input prices goes up, is that good? If you're a producer, the answer is no. So this will make the aggregate supply curves shift to the left because this becomes more expensive. So, and then on the other hand, if you have the more government regulation, if the government, keep imposing tax on farmers, make it harder or more expensive for them to produce. So all this have the dampening effects on aggregate supply curve. So aggregate supply curve will shift left. Okay, how does the aggregate supply curve shift to left? So you basically just move that whole thing to the left, like that. So this is your point B, excuse me. So I usually like to use the arrows like that, from left to right, in this case from right to left. So A as prime, and this is your point B. So if you indicate with point A and B, you know which point starts first from which point. So yes, so aggregate supply curve shift to the left now because of more strict government regulation, more intervention, so harder for the producer. Usually it means, there are more regulation to comply to, so that can discourage people from wanting to produce, or get into the business. So input prices being more expensive. For example, if you're a farmer, and fertilizers prices go up, so then it's more expensive for you to produce, so therefore you produce less. So that's just one farming industry, and assuming that you could apply that to all other products and services, so it has the same effects there. So the other one, the third one, we only have three here for the aggregate supply side, is productivity. So if there's an increase in productivity, and that's good. For example, if you hire workers to work for you, and suddenly, you decide to play rock music in a working environment, and suddenly you realize that workers' productivity has gone up, because they listen to music and work at the same time. So AS curve will shift to the right. So you hear people talk about, double the productivity. And that could come about by investing in a machine that will help your workers. For example, you might buy a piece of capital like a machine, to help your worker to become more productive. Typically, we say computers. Computers can make our workers more productive. Instead of the old days, you have to walk to the office. 10 pieces of document to somebody, you could just send it through email, and you could digitize everything. So you actually work more, but you get more things done as well, because you save all this walking, from one office to another to communicate. You could just communicate through email. Assuming that you type faster and send up the email faster than you have to walk, Okay, so basically if AS curve shift to the right, so that would be the opposite of it. So once again, we could just change the direction. And so this becomes AS curve shift to the right. So your starting point will be point A, and this will be your point B. I didn't draw this earlier, but this is the same thing. So if AS curve shift to the right, you would have, instead of 10, it dropped down to, say, 5. And so instead of this is 17, instead of 15, it goes up to 17. So because you're at the lower point vertically, and then you're at a higher point from left to right, that's how we read it in your real GDP numbers here. Okay, so that's how it is. And if you do it the other way, it will be vice versa. Like I say, if all these factors or all these variables that we discussed, you move in the opposite direction, all come down, then AS curve will shift to the right here, and AS curve will shift to the left here. So, so we're almost coming to an end here. So there are only two other concepts I'd like to cover. There are two types of inflation. Okay. So this is very typical economic concept of any textbook you see. One is called demand pull inflation, and second one is known as cost push. So this demand pull inflation is due to aggregate demand curve increase. So earlier, if you remember, if you move the AD curve up, right, so you're at the higher point vertically, so it costs, in that case, it will cause inflation to happen, because inflation is on your right-hand side. This is your PI, price and inflation. So that's your demand pull inflation. So anything that shifts the AD curve to the right, like more government expenditure, more investment, more consumption, yes, it will increase your real GDP, but it also will raise the price or it will cause inflation. So we call it demand pull inflation. This is coming up from the aggregate demand side. Now the cost push inflation is coming from the aggregate supply side. And specifically, this is due to a decrease, which I erase it now. Decrease means the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. So remember the first diagram we drew was from point A here, point B here. So when AS curve shifts to the left, then you're on a higher point in terms of price. So this is a case where AS curve decrease, or if you want to be specific, shift to left. AD could increase or shift right. Okay. So in other words, when you look at this term here, really, this is the source of it coming from aggregate demand. Cost push comes from the input prices, cost of doing business, and things like that. So the last thing I want to talk about is the so-called the government influence on the aggregate demand. So we say that, for example, next chapter or so, we'll talk about Keynesian fiscal policy and monetary policy, which have very heavy government intervention. So for example, earlier we talked about aggregate demand side, we talked about how, if the government were to increase the tax, what would happen? Yes, it will have a dampening effects on the your real GDP. Basically, AD curve will shift to the left. So government could affect your real GDP through taxes, or favorably through the more government expenditure, or through interest rate, because the Federal Reserve Bank, which we'll talk about in the next two chapters, or your central bank, could also control the interest rate. They use the interest rate to control the money supply, and therefore they introduce monetary policy that would also affect our economy as well. So three things the government could use very effectively to control the economy is number one, interest rate, number two, taxes, and then number three, more regulation, more government intervention. So on the opposite spectrum of it is what we call supply side economy. Some of you who are older out there might remember what the supply side economy under the Reagan administration in the 80s. So I think this word came about during the Reagan administration. So he was famous for, basically using the supply side to control the economy. And because he didn't like to use the word control the economy, but he said we influence the economy by using the supply side, aggregate supply side policy, and basically using these three right here, okay? But really, what Reagan did was the opposite, that he actually wanted to reduce the government regulation. And in terms of that, he would like to reduce input prices and make it more efficient or less expensive for labors and wages. And then also to increase, and this one is a plus, yeah. So all this thing actually make the aggregate supply curve all shift to the right. Less input prices, get rid of this minimum wages, veto it, for example. So that would have an effect on the wages as well as the labor, and make people more productive. So, and also, not too much government. Cut down on government regulation. So all this will have incentive for people to work and also to open their own business, take risk and be entrepreneurs, for example. So all these things that the government use an aggregate supply side to affect the economy favorably is known as supply side economy, which you can read more about it in your towards the end of your chapter. So that's all for today's chapter 8 video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.